perhaps we can talk about particularly your focus in in the Italian Renaissance figure.
Yeah.
Why you start, why you, how you found um, Lodovico Razzarelli uh,
Okay. All right.
in relation to this Hermetic literature?
Okay. Well, thank you for asking because I love to tell the story. It's a very nice story. Um, as a background, let me say first of all that yeah, because not all your viewers may know this, but so the Corpus Hermeticum, the most important collection of Hermetic writings, was translated by an Italian humanist, Marsilio Ficino, a very well-known Platonist, the first translator of the complete Platonic literature into Latin, and also, yeah, in many ways, a very important figure. So Ficino is famous, and he in around 1463 was given access to a manuscript, Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, and he was asked by Cosimo de' Medici, the leader of Florence, to translate it. Okay, so he did, and it got published in 1471. And now the thing is that this translation by Ficino, the so-called Pimander, as it was called, made a big impact in the Renaissance on many people. It got published in a whole series of later editions. It got translated. There was a lot of interest in Hermes based upon Ficino's translation. And so, well, the famous English historian Francis Yates then wrote in 1964, she wrote his famous book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which became a bestseller. It's still a bestseller. And here she tells a kind of grand story about the Hermetic literature in the Renaissance, the Hermetic tradition, as she calls it. And it basically says that Ficino translates the Corpus Hermeticum, then a couple of other famous intellectuals like Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno and others discovered this literature. This became a huge Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. This survived until the early 17th century, and then finally it declined for all kinds of reasons that doesn't matter here. But this book became incredibly influential, and so it created this picture of the Hermetic tradition with Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno, famous intellectuals at the heart of the Hermetic tradition. That was the idea. And when I discovered Lodovico Lazzarelli, that was the narrative. That was the story. Everybody assumed that. And many people still assume that. Now, what happened is that I was living in 1997 in Paris for a year and a half. I spent the time there. So I was living in Paris, and I was very good friends with the main scholar specialist of esotericism at the time, Antoine Fèvre, who was professor of history of esotericism at Sorbonne, at the École Pratique des Hautes Études of the Sorbonne in Paris. And Fèvre was a very good friend of mine. He died a couple of years ago, and he has created this whole field of study basically with his work. So I was a lot in touch with him, and one evening I went to his home in Meudon, and we spent a nice evening together. And at one point he went to the toilet, and I was looking around at his bookcases, similar bookcases like you have there behind you, behind glass. And he had some kind of a section with old antiquarian books. And somehow I picked out a book there, and it turned out to be a 16th century old book, very valuable. He had that, an antiquarian book, by a French author that I'd never heard of. And it was about Hermetica. And something in that book caught my interest. I do not know why, but it's almost like destiny. At that moment, like Hermes was ticking on my shoulder, like, pay attention to this book. So I picked out this book and I asked Antoine, I'd love to read this. And he said, oh, you can borrow it, which is extraordinary. It's a very expensive 16th century volume, but I could take it home. So I took it with me, and then I started reading it in bed at night. the old 16th century French, very difficult. And I found out that part of the text consisted of an author I'd never heard of, Loi Lazarel in French. Lazarel, never heard of the name. The Crater Hermetis, Le Bassin d'Hermès, the Basin of Hermes. Never heard of it, but I tried reading it, and it was fascinating. It resonated somehow. I basically could not understand what I was reading. It was very difficult, but something in it ticked, something it clicked with me. Then a couple of weeks later, I went back to Amsterdam, and I made a visit, as I did more often, to the famous Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica, the so-called Ritman Library, which was the best, most important library of Hermetic literature in the world. It is in Amsterdam. So I went there, and I met, by chance, I met a guy who was sitting there in a corner, who was making translations. I asked, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm translating texts from Latin into English. And so we started talking. His name was Ruud Bouthorn. I didn't know him. And I asked, well, what are you translating? And he said, well, at the moment I'm working on a 15th century Italian thinker, Lodovico Lazzarelli. And then suddenly it clicked in my mind, Loi Lazarel, Lodovico Lazzarelli, same person. What a coincidence. I'd never heard of him. Within 2 weeks, I heard about him twice, and I met this guy. Incredible. So yeah, we started talking. He turned out to be an excellent translator from Neo-Latin, and so we started working together, and we ended up producing this book about Lodovico Lazzarelli. So we translated all the Hermetic texts by Lazzarelli into English. We made critical edition with annotation and English translation, a large introduction. It got published in 2005. And why was this important? It basically, Lazzarelli changed my entire idea about this so-called Hermetic tradition radically. So what was the point? Lazzarelli is an unknown figure. He was a minor humanist poet, not nearly as famous as Ficino. So, okay, one day, Lazzarelli, well, he is in Rome, in the Holy City. He's in Rome. He goes to the Vatican, and he sees a public preacher, a preacher on the streets, who is preaching to the crowds. And this turns out to be a certain Giovanni da Correggio, who was a kind of charismatic speaker. And they became friends. Correggio made a big impression on Lazzarelli. Lazzarelli became his pupil. Then a few, well, not so long after that, we have several texts that Lazzarelli has written and offered to his master, to his guru, to Correggio. And one of these texts consists of a translation of the final 3 treatises from the Corpus Hermeticum. The point is this, that Ficino had translated the Corpus Hermeticum, but the text consists of actually 17 treatises. And the manuscript that Ficino was using was incomplete. It had only 14 treatises. Now, Lazzarelli discovered an independent manuscript with the extra treatises and translated them, which means that it's not correct that Ficino was the only one to translate the Corpus Hermeticum. Lazzarelli was the other translator, even though it's a small part, but he's the other translator. He should be mentioned. Okay, he makes beautiful manuscripts, which he offers as a gift to Correggio, consisting of Ficino's translation, his own translation, and of the famous Asclepius that I mentioned earlier, a text in Latin, a Hermetic text in Latin. Okay, then not that much longer, on a Palm Sunday in the 80s, in the 1480s, don't recall now which year, I think 1486, I'm not sure, but I think it's 86. Correggio makes a spectacular appearance in Rome. You know, he comes there, he draws attention to the crowds in all kinds of ways, and he finally dresses up like Jesus Christ. He dresses like Jesus Christ in a white mantle. He has a crown of thorns on his head. He has all kind of symbolic things with him, and he's sitting on a donkey, and he enters a white donkey, and he enters Rome. So he repeats the story of Jesus who enters Jerusalem, and now he enters Rome in the same way. He attracted a great crowd, and it is clear from his presentation that he believed that he was in a certain way, he impersonated Christ, but he was also impersonating Hermes in some way. So he saw himself as a kind of a Hermetic Christ. Now, very spectacular, and there's a lot that could be said about Correggio because he had a later career, but that would go a bit far maybe now. But Lazzarelli was incredibly impressed by him. He saw him as the figure who united the Christian message with the Hermetic message. So that was for him, that was the core of what it was all about. A couple of years later, he writes a very impressive text, the Crater Hermetis, which he tries to offer to the king of Naples, Ferrante, a famous king, very influential guy. And this text is very important, and that's one of the texts that we published. And this is a new Hermetic dialogue, newly written by Lazzarelli, but very strongly modeled on the original Hermetic literature, in which Lazzarelli takes the role of the teacher of Hermes Trismegistus, and he's teaching two pupils, Ferrante, the king, and his secretary and first minister, Pontano, Giovanni Pontano. So two pupils, one master. They ask all kinds of questions, and there's a very lively dialogue between the two, and it's very impressive. Lazzarelli was a very gifted writer. He writes beautiful Latin. It's poetic. There are a couple of poems also in it. And he develops a very distinctive new understanding of the Hermetica, which is factually incorrect, but extremely impressive and creative and fascinating. So what he basically says, and now I'm combining what we know about Lazzarelli and the Crater Hermetis, so I'm basically collapsing some things in one shorter story here. But basically what Lazzarelli believed was very spectacular. He said that Correggio was Jesus Christ, who had come back to earth in the shape of Hermes. And the story behind this goes back to the Hermetic literature itself, because if you read the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, the so-called Poimandres, it is the account of a visionary encounter between Hermes and Poimandres. Now, Poimandres is a manifestation of God himself, who appears in a vision to Hermes. And he is the divine light himself. He's basically a representation of God. And so that's Poimandres. And now Lazzarelli is referring to this well-known text. And he is saying, well, what actually happens there? And this is a creative new idea by Lazzarelli that nobody had ever said before. But Lazzarelli says, well, Hermes was encountering Poimandres, and Poimandres was basically the Son of God. And the Son of God is no one else than the Logos. In the Greek New Testament, the Logos is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So in other words, Poimandres, this figure who appears to a pagan sage, to Hermes, is actually no one else than Christ. And so the story that Lazzarelli then creates is that Christ himself first appeared to a pagan wise man, to Hermes, and Hermes partly understood him and partly misunderstood him because he was a pagan and he was not entirely enlightened. Then later the Logos, the Son of God, is incarnated as Jesus Christ, and that for Lazzarelli, of course, that's the beginning of Christianity, which he believes in very strongly. And now the third stage has come. So now Correggio has appeared, and Correggio brings the two traditions together. He brings the Hermetic tradition of Poimandres together with Christianity. And this means that this will, for Lazzarelli, be the beginning of the renovation of true Christianity. So he believes that we are now embarking on a new phase in the history of Christianity, which will be based on the fusion and the integration of pagan Hermetic wisdom and Christian wisdom, and that will be the future of Christianity. So that's what he believes. Now, of course, none of this has happened, but it's an extremely creative, original, fascinating idea, and the text is really a gem. I think it's one of the most impressive small Hermetic texts that have been written. Lazzarelli was a brilliant mind. And so, yeah, and why is this important to me? It completely, and then I come back to the grand narratives of Francis Yates. It basically completely undermines Francis Yates' narrative, because she said it was all about the great individuals like Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno. Now, actually, I come to the conclusion that none of these people were really Hermetic thinkers. Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum, but he was much more interested in Platonism, and he basically disregarded the Hermetic literature very quickly. For him, it was Plato, not Hermes. Pico della Mirandola was very interested in many things, but mostly in the Jewish Kabbalah, the secret wisdom of the Jews, but not really in the Hermetica. He knew them. It was not important to him, not very much. Giordano Bruno knew about the Hermetica, but it's not central to his work. So if you're looking for a real Hermetic figure, and real Hermetist in the 15th century, it's not Ficino, it's not Pico, it's not Giordano Bruno, it is Lazzarelli. He is the real example of a Christian Hermetist. So why did Francis Yates marginalize him in her story? Simply because he was a small fish. He was far too small. Ficino, Pico, Bruno were famous names, so you could hang your hat on them. You could tell a great story about their Hermetic tradition, very influential, very impressive. But the story was false, because the true story of the Hermetica is that a minor figure like Lazzarelli wrote a fantastic text, very influential. No, not very influential, but very, very impressive. And there is a small and kind of discreet Hermetic tradition that continues after Lazzarelli to Cornelius Agrippa, the author on magic in the 16th century, and a few other names might be mentioned. And the final thing here is that Francis Yates wrote his bestseller in which he said Hermetica is all about magic. And magic for her was at the origin of the scientific revolution. So the Hermetic magic paved the way for modern science. That was her big story. But Lazzarelli, the true Hermetist, was not interested in magic, almost not. He had nothing with science, was not his concern. He was interested in a spiritual, individual Christian message. But that message simply did not fit Francis Yates' narrative. It's not what she wanted to hear. It's not what she was interested in. It didn't fit her agenda. And so she pushed Lazzarelli away in some footnotes. And then so the real Hermetist was pushed off the stage, as I put it. And other people who are not Hermetists were put on the stage, even though they didn't belong there. So
Yeah,
my long story to a short answer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating, long list of literature, and everybody has their own biases,
Yes.
including religious or ideologic biases.